What's the most important problem that beginners have? Their biggest challenge? I'm glad you asked, bud. We're going to talk about that today, and we're going to tell you how to focus on it and make you a better watercolor painter. Bar none, it is the #1 problem that beginners face. Listen in, you advanced painters, because you need to check your skills on this one. It's also a good warm-up. Hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Well, you know what? It's been a while since I've done any kind of a video specifically for beginners or people that are learning and really wanting to develop their basic skills. Learning to paint in watercolor can be very frustrating, especially if you've never painted in watercolor before. It's kind of like pushing a wet noodle across a table. It's tricky, it's unpredictable, sometimes it even feels futile, some things just not going right. Watercolor is a bit counterintuitive, especially if you're coming from another medium, like say acrylic or oils. But learning watercolor is not a sprint. It's not here's a step-by-step formula and you're gonna do it. It's a marathon. You've got to build skills. You've got to build understanding. There's no simple one and done recipe. That's just not watercolor. And in building that understanding, I want to give you a focus. If you're a beginner, here's what I want you to focus on first before you focus on anything else. Watercolor is worth it. I mean, it's a satisfying medium. And honestly, it's not that hard if you follow this focus and then build on it, okay? I'm not going to give artistic advice today, okay? This is not about how to draw better, how to use colors, color theory, how to make great compositions. That all comes later. However, that builds on this foundation. Now, before I tell you what this focus is, let me tell you the best way to learn this. You've got to break out the paint and the paper. You've got to assimilate those focuses, those techniques, those ideas. You got to experience those yourself. Experimentation, observation, just playing with the medium, and yes, I'm afraid so, just good old-fashioned practice. You can watch videos, you can read books, and they might give you some good tips, they might point you in the right direction, but they're never going to teach you watercolor, not ultimately. Learning watercolor is a feel, like riding a bike. You just have to do it, and you have to do it again, and you have to do it again, until you get it, and then you got it. Or at least what I'm talking about today, okay? The artistic part, that may take a little longer, and that varies with different people and what your artistic visions are. But this core feel technique, this is hands-on understanding, getting to know the medium. If I were to categorize the basic understanding of watercolor in one way, it would be watercolor control or water control. Every class, every beginner I've ever instructed, these are where the problems came down to. Water control, water management, water control. First of all, you need to recognize that your medium is water. It's not like paint out of a tube, like acrylic or oils. You use paint out of a tube or out of a pan to color the water, but primarily what you're painting with is a lot of water. And it's primarily water. So how do you learn to control water? Practice? Okay. I know what you're thinking. Steve, you're not making this whole video just to tell me I need to practice. Well, sort of, but I just want to focus how you do that, okay? And numero uno is water control. All right, so what do we talk about? What do we look at? How do we analyze? How do we figure out water control? Well, there's two key factors when you're painting with watercolor. How much water is in your brush and how much water is on your paper. Everything boils down to that in being able to control watercolor. And those two factors can change drastically and in the moment even. There's no set, here's how much water you use in your brush, here's how much water you use on the paper. It's a spectrum. And it changes drastically as you paint. The more you do it, a feel comes for it eventually. Now here's what I suggest. Start off with a basic flat wash. This is the way I teach. A flat wash is just a square of paint and color. Well, it can be any shape really, it doesn't have to be a square. Painted perfectly flat, meaning the color is flat and even, almost like you put it on with an airbrush. As little variation as possible, no puddles, no outer edges and rims, a perfect flat wash. Just that little bit of practice alone will go a long ways towards helping your understanding of water control. Don't skimp on it. Don't underestimate it. A really great way to practice flat washes is swatches. Get out some of your watercolor palettes or some of your watercolors. You want to catalog them and do a collection of swatches. And focus on making those perfect square, perfectly even flat washes. Where you have too much water, dry out your brush, pick some up, try to lay it down in one nice even coat. If you don't do it, try again. You'll eventually get the feel of it. Next, I recommend being able to call up any value that you need. That means from the lightest whisper of color, just barely pale, slight little bits of color, to the darkest colors, while still maintaining a flat wash. This will not only continue to practice your ability to make a flat wash, but will teach you how to control the ratio between water and pigment to get very saturated colors or back off on them. Remember what I said at the beginning. Watercolor is about how much water is in your brush and how much water is on your paper. And water dissolves pigment. You're picking up more pigment. So the darker you make your paint, the more pigment you're going to need to pick up. So the ratio of pigment needs to increase. So learn how to take water out of your brush. That's just paper towels, wiping, squeezing, adding, dipping. Learn to do that in even the most minute amounts or drastic amounts. Okay, so let's recap. Flat wash, swatches, practicing water to pigment ratio, going from light to dark and back to light again. Next, it's a good idea to master the blend or the graduated wash, because you will use that everywhere. Basically, that's going from color or pigment, and I recommend starting out by doing a graduated wash where you go from color and pigment to no color. That's water with pigment, reducing the amount of water in your brush, rinsing out the pigment out of your brush, taking water out of your brush, and blending out that wash until it's nothing. If you can do that, you can do any number of variations on that. This is one you're going to need to practice. Well, they're all are ones you need to practice, but especially this one again and again and again. This is one I especially recommend you can almost do in your sleep, practically without thinking about it. Before long, you will be dabbing your brush on paper towels or wiping on the edge of your jar or dipping in just to change the water. You will do it intuitively without even thinking about how you're doing it, but you know instinctively that's how much you need or don't need. The water I'm talking about. And here's a great variation on that, combining everything we've talked about so far. Put down a perfect flat wash. I mean your most perfect flat wash. Let it dry, let it completely dry, bone dry, then go in with a different color from one edge of that shape, whatever it is. It could be a sphere, square, weird shape, it doesn't matter, and do a graduated wash on top of that dry flat wash. You've just added color in a glaze. In a graduated glaze, you've just altered the color underneath. And if you practice that over and over again, you've just learned another key technique you will use over and over and over again. You can add color interest to anything that's already been painted. You can change the value, usually make it darker, okay? The next focus in water control, I would say, would be charging. So go back now and do one of these flat washes. Then get some stronger pigment, maybe reduce some of the water in your brush a little bit, and charge. Now charging is just dabbing color into a wet wash. It is a small version of what we call a wet and wet wash. And more on that in a minute. Charging is useful in painting, especially in small shapes or in shapes that are contained where you have a lot of control over that shape. And you just want to dab color and see it bleed. It'll bleed out and do some almost automatic shading if you get the consistency right. So you need to practice that. Now what I recommend is do one again, a flat wash. Let it dry for a few seconds. Get your stronger pigment, charge into that shape. Watch it spread. It's cool to see. Initially, it's going to spread probably quite a bit. Now do another square or shape. Get pigment. This time, let it dry about twice as long and charge in. What you start to see is that the pigment moves less and less. Do another one, another shape. This time let the wash dry maybe 3 times as long. Charge in and see, and you'll start to understand how drying times affect wet and wet wash. Very key in water control. Eventually one of a couple things will happen. You'll get a backwash. That's if you've brought too much water to the charge, and it will push that drying wash back, give you a bloom or a cauliflower. Or it's dried enough that when you charge, the pigment will move almost not at all. And finally, and I think this is probably the most fun, this is where watercolorists play all the time. This is where I do spontaneous painting, and that is a wet and wet wash. Now the charge we just talked about is a form of a wet and wet wash, usually smaller in scale, but I'm talking about the big, grandiose wet and wet wash. Lots of water on the paper, could be clear water, bringing paint into that clear water and letting it go here and there and just having fun with it. Clouds is a great example. In landscape, you know, could be tree lines or foregrounds, and where you've painted a whole area in one color and then you go back in and start dabbing and watching that paint. These are essentially large scale charges. There are a few rules here. I mean, this is where most artists, as I said, play. And it's a great way to see what happens. Now, the caution is don't get too much water and don't overdo it. The more pigment and water you add, the more of a mess you're going to make until you have a puddle. And big part of water control is learn to pick water up. I have seen this in so many beginner classes, is water just keeps getting added and added and added, and before you know it, the paper is just a puddle and all the colors are merging together. No, you've got to learn to use water in measured amounts. How much? Well, that's where you have to play. Enough to spread the color, but not so much as that you ended up with one big single color puddle mess. And learn to pick color and water up. So important. Just get a brush, dab it in there like a syringe. Now your brush has to be dry or almost dry. If it's not, you gotta squeeze it into a rag and start picking that water up. Learn to pick water up. But wet and wet washes are just so much fun. You don't have to be painting anything in particular. And vary the pigment load. Put in light washes and go get some heavy pigment. Dab it in, see what happens. You can use a spray bottle if you want. Spray the paper, watch it go. Just watch how much water you end up with. Get a big brush, big fat brush, one that's dry. If you get too much water, just start picking some of it up. So those are the focuses. I hope that helps you. I know I've talked about these before on my channel, and I'm just hoping that putting them in this emphasis, in this focus, maybe you've tried to go past all this and you think, I'm just not getting anywhere, I'm having a lot of trouble. Don't be afraid, no matter how long you've been painting, don't be afraid to take your skills back to sort of a beginner or fundamental level. I did that. It's one of the ways that I discovered spontaneous painting. After painting for about 25 years, I decided I wanted to take my watercolor skills back to zero and learn them all over again, because I felt like I was in a rut and I was assuming too much. I was so glad I did. Go back and do a check on all your water handling and water control skills. See where they stand. See if they're up to snuff. If they're not, practice them. I still warm up on these, and I've done this hundreds of times. Then when you're ready to develop your more artistic skills, like better drawing, better rendering of the subject, better color theory understanding, better composition, whatever it is, you'll be able to build on this focus, on these skills that you've spent a lot of time really honing. Hope that helps. Thanks everybody. Appreciate you watching. Thank you patrons for your support of this channel. We'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.